They opened Bloody Mary and found teeth growing inside her womb. Not from a baby, something else entirely. And what her doctors saw that night in 1558 was so horrifying, they buried the evidence in a lead coffin that's never been opened. The medical term for what consumed her from the inside changes everything you thought you knew about her phantom pregnancies. You're about to find out why. November 17th, 1558. The moment Queen Mary I's heart stopped beating, her doctors did something that would have been unthinkable for any other monarch in Tudor England. They didn't wait for mourning rituals. They didn't follow protocol. Instead, they locked the doors to her private chambers at St. James's Palace and began cutting into her body while it was still warm. Royal autopsies were extraordinarily rare, reserved only for the most suspicious deaths or when political necessity demanded absolute proof. Yet here were the Queen's own physicians, men who had served her faithfully for years, insisting with alarming urgency that they needed to examine what was inside her womb. The counselors standing guard outside heard the sound of medical instruments, hushed voices filled with tension, and then something that made their blood run cold, complete and utter silence. When the doors finally opened hours later, the physicians emerged looking like men who had witnessed something beyond their comprehension. Their faces had gone pale, drained of all color. One of them trembled so violently he could barely hold the bloodied cloth in his hands. Another looked as though he might vomit right there in the corridor. These weren't inexperienced students. These were seasoned medical professionals who had performed countless dissections, who had treated gruesome battlefield injuries, who had seen death in every imaginable form. Whatever they had discovered inside their queen's body had shaken them to their very core. Dr. George Owen, the senior physician who had served Mary throughout her entire reign, was the first to speak. His voice barely rose above a whisper, and those present noted that he seemed physically incapable of meeting anyone's eyes directly. He reported that they had discovered the cause of Her Majesty's years of suffering, but his words were deliberately vague, carefully chosen to obscure rather than illuminate. There was corruption in the womb, he said, a growth of unnatural proportions, something that had been slowly consuming the Queen from the inside for years. But when pressed for specifics, when asked to describe in medical detail what they had actually seen when they opened Mary's abdomen, he refused. The other physicians nodded in grim agreement, but none of them would elaborate further. This wasn't normal medical discretion. This wasn't respect for royal dignity or modesty. This was fear. Raw, unmistakable fear that whatever they had discovered inside Mary Tudor was too disturbing, too politically explosive, too biologically impossible to discuss openly. One of the junior doctors who had assisted in the examination reportedly fled London that very night, abandoning his prestigious position at court without any explanation to his colleagues or family. Another physician fell violently ill within days of the autopsy and died before the month was out, taking whatever horrifying knowledge he possessed to his grave. The official death record claimed a sudden fever, but those close to the situation whispered darker possibilities. The records from that night were buried almost immediately, sealed away in archives that would remain closed for over 4 centuries. The few documents that managed to survive are frustratingly vague, written in coded medical language that seems specifically designed to hide the truth rather than preserve it for posterity. But one thing was absolutely crystal clear to everyone who had been present in those chambers or who spoke with the physicians afterward. Something had been growing inside Mary Tudor. Something massive. Something that she had believed with desperate, tragic, all-consuming certainty was England's heir. Something that had swollen her belly to grotesque proportions, caused her unimaginable agony for years, and ultimately killed her at the age of 42. And whatever it was so horrifying, so medically unprecedented, so politically dangerous that trained physicians literally could not bring themselves to record the full truth on paper. The question that haunted everyone who witnessed that night or heard whispers of what had been found was simple and terrible. If Mary had believed she was carrying a child, if her body had mimicked every known sign of pregnancy, what exactly had been taking up residence in her womb all those months? But to understand what those doctors found, you need to go back 3 years earlier, to when Mary's body first began betraying her in the cruelest way imaginable. April 1554. Mary Tudor stood before her assembled court at the age of 38 and made an announcement that sent shockwaves rippling across every court in Europe. She was with child. Recently married to Philip II of Spain, the Queen declared herself pregnant with the heir that England desperately needed to secure the Catholic succession. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Church bells rang throughout London. their joyous peals echoing through the streets for hours. Bonfires were lit on every corner as citizens danced and sang, thrilled beyond measure that their queen would finally produce an heir. Foreign ambassadors rushed to dispatch urgent messages back to their governments, because this changed absolutely everything about the European political landscape. A Catholic heir meant England would remain aligned with Spain and Rome indefinitely. It meant the Protestant Reformation would be crushed. It meant Mary's half-sister Elizabeth, the Protestant hope, would never take the throne. The political implications were staggering and far-reaching. Philip of Spain was ecstatic for purely strategic reasons. His marriage to Mary had been a calculated political alliance designed to bring England under Spanish influence. But without an heir, his position was precarious at best. Mary was 17 years older than him, in notoriously poor health, and widely unpopular among her Protestant subjects who resented the Spanish marriage. If she died childless, he would lose all claim to English power and influence. But a baby? A child who would inherit England and eventually Spain? That would create a Catholic superpower capable of dominating all of Europe for generations to come. Mary herself was utterly transformed by the news of her pregnancy. Court observers and her personal attendants reported that she seemed happier than anyone had ever witnessed, practically glowing with maternal joy and religious certainty that God had finally blessed her. She commissioned elaborate cradles from the finest craftsmen in England, hired experienced wet nurses, and ordered christening gowns embroidered with precious gold thread. She spent hours debating potential names with her ladies-in-waiting, made detailed plans for the child's education, and devoted entire days to praying in her private chapel for a healthy son who would continue her Catholic restoration. The physical signs seemed utterly undeniable to everyone at court. Her belly began to swell noticeably, growing larger week by week in a pattern that seemed consistent with pregnancy. She experienced severe morning sickness, vomiting frequently during the early months, just as pregnant women were known to do. Her breast became tender and enlarged, another classic symptom. She claimed to feel movement inside her womb, that distinctive quickening sensation that pregnant women described as the first fluttering kicks of life. Court physicians examined her multiple times and confirmed what seemed obvious to everyone present. The Queen was indeed pregnant. Due date calculations were made based on when she reported feeling the first movements. The baby should arrive in late May or early June of 1555. Preparations intensified throughout the spring as the expected due date approached. But what no one understood at the time was that something else was happening inside Mary's body. Something that would have been completely impossible for 16th century medicine to comprehend or diagnose. The swelling in her belly, the morning sickness, the breast changes, the cessation of her monthly cycles, all of these were real, genuine physical symptoms. But they weren't caused by a baby. They were caused by something growing from her own cells. Something that was hijacking her body's reproductive system and tricking it into believing she was pregnant. Deep inside Mary's ovary, a tumor had been developing for years, possibly since her late 20s or early 30s. This wasn't an ordinary tumor. This was something that modern medicine would eventually classify as an ovarian teratoma, a growth that develops from germ cells, the same cells that should have become eggs. And teratomas are biological nightmares because they contain something that makes them fundamentally different from any other type of tumor. They contain pluripotent stem cells, meaning cells capable of differentiating into any type of human tissue: skin, hair, teeth, bone, even primitive neural tissue and eye structures. A teratoma doesn't just grow as a shapeless mass. It tries to build. It attempts to create complex structures using the same developmental blueprints that form a human being. And the one growing inside Mary Tudor was doing exactly that. The teratoma was producing human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, the exact same hormone that a developing embryo produces during pregnancy. This hormone is what modern pregnancy tests detect. It's what causes morning sickness, breast changes, and the cessation of menstrual cycles. Mary's body was flooded with this hormone, not because she was carrying a baby, but because the tumor growing in her ovary was biochemically mimicking pregnancy. Her endocrine system couldn't tell the difference between a real embryo and this cellular imposter. To her pituitary gland, her thyroid, her entire hormonal cascade, the signals were identical. Every symptom she experienced was genuine. Her breasts enlarged and prepared for nursing because her body genuinely believed it would need to feed an infant. She vomited in the mornings because the HCG levels were genuinely elevated. Her periods stopped because her body genuinely thought it was pregnant. The physicians who examined her confirmed pregnancy because every diagnostic tool available in Tudor England pointed to the same conclusion. They felt her swollen belly. They observed her symptoms. They had no reason to doubt what seemed medically obvious. But inside her abdomen, instead of a developing fetus with a beating heart and forming limbs, there was a chaotic mass of tissue. Cells that should have remained dormant were activating. Cells that should have become eggs were instead following confused developmental pathways, attempting to build structures without any coherent blueprint or organization. And it was growing larger with every passing week. May 1555 arrived, the expected due date came and went. No baby. Mary remained sequestered in her birthing chamber at Hampton Court Palace, her belly still massively swollen and firm, absolutely insisting that she could feel movement, that the child was simply not ready yet, that God would deliver her heir when the time was divinely appointed. The midwives tried to reassure her that first pregnancies could extend beyond the expected date. Give it time, they said, trying to mask their growing concern. June arrived. Still no baby. The Queen's attendants began exchanging increasingly worried glances when they thought she couldn't see them. Mary's behavior was becoming noticeably strange, even alarming to those who knew her well. She would sit motionless for hours with both hands pressed against her swollen belly, talking softly to the child she believed was inside her, promising it would be born soon, assuring it that God would protect them both. She absolutely refused to leave the birthing chamber, utterly convinced that labor could begin at any moment and she needed to be ready. Outside the palace walls, rumors began spreading throughout London like wildfire. Something was clearly wrong with the Queen's pregnancy. She had been in confinement for over a month past her due date with absolutely no sign of imminent delivery. Foreign ambassadors sent increasingly confused and concerned dispatches back to their governments, struggling to explain a situation that made no medical sense. The Spanish envoy wrote that he had personally seen the Queen's swollen belly, had even placed his hand on it at her insistence to feel what she claimed was the baby moving. But no child had appeared. What was happening inside Hampton Court Palace? What was taking so long? 2 full months past the expected due date. Mary's physicians were now deeply, profoundly concerned, but absolutely none of them dared suggest what was becoming horrifyingly, undeniably obvious to anyone with medical training. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. But how could they tell the Queen? How could they tell a woman who had staked her entire legacy, her religious mission, her political legitimacy on producing a Catholic heir, that her swollen belly contained nothing but a biological mistake? One physician, Dr. John Feckenham, finally worked up the courage to speak a dangerous truth. During a private examination, he felt something that troubled him deeply. What he felt inside the Queen's abdomen didn't move like a child, he reported to the counselors. It felt solid, immovable, like a mass of some kind, rather than a living baby that should be shifting and turning. He recommended bringing in other physicians, perhaps even surgeons who might have different expertise, to examine the Queen more thoroughly. The reaction to his honesty was swift and brutal. Feckenham was dismissed from court that same day. He was given a generous pension to ensure his silence and sent far from London with explicit, threatening instructions to never discuss what he had observed inside the Queen's body. Other physicians who might have shared his growing suspicions saw exactly what happened to him and wisely kept their dangerous thoughts to themselves. Speaking the medical truth about the Queen's condition was clearly far more dangerous to their careers and possibly their lives than maintaining the increasingly implausible fiction that she was simply having an unusually long pregnancy. By August of 1555, even Mary herself could no longer deny the devastating truth that had become obvious to everyone around her. Whatever had swollen her belly to enormous proportions, whatever she had felt moving and growing inside her for months, it wasn't a child. It had never been a child. The pregnancy announcement had been made with great ceremony to every royal court in Europe. Massive celebrations had been held in England and Spain. Political alliances had been formed, and diplomatic strategies had been completely restructured based on the confident assumption of a Catholic heir. And now Mary had to publicly admit it was all a catastrophic mistake. The political fallout was utterly devastating. Protestant enemies across Europe mocked the Catholic Queen with merciless cruelty. Pamphlets circulated throughout Protestant territories, claiming that God had cursed her barren womb as direct divine punishment for burning Protestant heretics at the stake. Some whispered that she had deliberately lied about being pregnant, faking the entire thing to secure her position and prevent Elizabeth from gathering support. Others suggested something far darker and more disturbing, that Mary had been possessed by demons, that what grew in her belly was something unholy rather than a child, that this was proof of God's judgment against her reign. Philip of Spain was absolutely furious and deeply humiliated by the entire debacle. He had endured marriage to a woman he found physically repulsive and personally disagreeable. He had played the role of devoted, attentive husband, purely for political advantage. All of it had been for the promise of an heir that would give him legitimate claim to England's throne and create a Catholic dynasty. Now he had absolutely nothing to show for his sacrifice. He left England shortly after the phantom pregnancy ended, returning to Spain and deliberately avoiding his wife for months, making his disappointment and disgust abundantly clear to every court in Europe. Mary was utterly devastated in ways that went far beyond political embarrassment. She had wanted a child with desperate, all-consuming intensity. She had prayed for it daily, sometimes for hours at a time. She had believed with absolute, unshakable certainty that God would grant her this one thing, this one chance to secure the Catholic succession and prove that her reign had divine approval. The failure crushed something fundamental inside her soul. But here's what made the situation go from tragic to genuinely horrifying. Something had actually been inside her. Her belly had swollen to enormous, unprecedented proportions. She had experienced physical symptoms that even the most experienced physicians in England had confirmed and documented. Court records show that her abdomen measured larger than many women at full term. So if it wasn't a baby growing inside Mary Tudor's womb, what exactly had caused such dramatic, undeniable physical changes? Most people at the time assumed that would be the tragic end of the story. A heartbreaking case of false pregnancy caused by desperate psychological wish fulfillment, combined perhaps with some minor medical condition that mimicked a few pregnancy symptoms. Mary would recover emotionally, accept her fate as childless, and continue ruling England without an heir until she died or was succeeded by Elizabeth. The court would move on. The embarrassment would fade into history. Everyone would forget about the phantom pregnancy and focus on other political matters. But then something absolutely impossible happened. Something that would prove this wasn't just psychological delusion or wishful thinking. Something was genuinely, biologically, horrifyingly wrong inside the Queen's body. In early 1556, barely 18 months after the profound humiliation of her first phantom pregnancy, Mary Tudor stood before her court once again and announced she was pregnant. The reaction this time was dramatically, fundamentally different from the joyous celebrations of 1554. Instead of church bells and bonfires and dancing in the streets, there was widespread skepticism, concern, and barely concealed whispers of doubt. Foreign ambassadors reported in their dispatches that Mary seemed almost manic in her insistence, borderline hysterical as she claimed she felt the baby moving inside her, that this time it was absolutely real, that God had finally, truly answered her desperate prayers. Her belly began to swell again, and the growth was even more rapid and alarming than before. Within just a few weeks, she looked more pregnant than many women at full term. Court observers noted with growing unease that the Queen's abdomen was grotesquely, unnaturally distended, stretched impossibly tight like a drum about to burst. Something was definitely, undeniably inside her, causing dramatic swelling that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. But after what had happened during the first phantom pregnancy, almost no one at court believed it was actually a child. The skepticism was universal. Even Mary's most loyal Catholic supporters privately doubted her claims. Philip was reluctantly recalled from Spain, pressured by diplomatic necessity to return to England and play the role of expectant father once more. He came back unwillingly, clearly and obviously doubting his wife's claims, but unable to refuse without causing a major diplomatic incident that would damage Spanish interests. When he finally saw Mary again after months apart, multiple witnesses reported that he seemed genuinely shocked and disturbed by her appearance. Her belly was absolutely massive, grotesquely swollen beyond anything he had seen before. But her face was gaunt and haggard, aged far beyond her 40 years. Her eyes had a fevered, desperate quality that suggested she was teetering on the edge of complete mental and physical collapse. This time the symptoms were even more extreme, more disturbing, more medically alarming than during the first phantom pregnancy. Mary experienced severe, incapacitating abdominal pain that left her doubled over and literally crying out in agony. Her attendants reported that the screams could be heard throughout entire sections of the palace. She had extreme difficulty walking on her own because the mass in her belly had grown so enormously large that it affected her center of balance and made standing upright nearly impossible. She needed attendants to physically support her weight on both sides just to move from her bed to a chair. Her appetite vanished almost completely. She ate almost nothing, sometimes going entire days consuming only water, and perhaps a few bites of bread. Yet her abdomen continued to expand relentlessly while the rest of her body visibly wasted away. She looked like a woman in the final terminal stages of starvation, skeletal and emaciated everywhere except for that enormous, grotesque, swollen belly that seemed completely disconnected from the rest of her deteriorating frame. It was as though something inside her was consuming all her nutrients, all her body's resources, growing larger by feeding on her from the inside while the rest of her body slowly starved to death. The queen became utterly convinced she would die in childbirth. She made her will with solemn ceremony, distributed precious personal gifts to her closest ladies-in-waiting, and wrote detailed letters to Philip with specific instructions about how to rule England after she was gone. She spoke constantly, obsessively about the baby, about how her death would be worth the sacrifice to give England a Catholic heir, about how God would receive her soul knowing she had fulfilled her sacred duty. But she also seemed frightened in a way that went far beyond the normal, reasonable fears of childbirth that any woman might experience. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, startling her attendants who slept in the same chamber. She claimed she felt something wrong inside her, something moving in ways that didn't seem right, that didn't match what she remembered from the stories other women had told her about pregnancy. The movement caused sharp, stabbing pain that she said no pregnancy should ever cause. Her ladies-in-waiting tried desperately to comfort her, holding her hands and speaking soothing words, but they too were deeply disturbed by what they were observing up close. One of them later wrote in a private letter that was discovered centuries afterward that the queen's belly felt fundamentally wrong when touched. Not soft and rounded like a pregnant woman's naturally flexible abdomen should feel, but hard, rigid, and wrong, as though something solid and completely immovable had taken up permanent residence inside her. The expected due date came and passed once again. Mary remained in strict confinement, her belly still massively, grotesquely swollen, desperately insisting that the baby would come soon, that she just needed to wait a little longer, that God's timing was perfect even if she couldn't understand it. But this time there was far less hope among her attendants and far more palpable dread. Everyone who attended her closely could see with their own eyes that something was catastrophically, terribly wrong. The queen was in constant, unrelenting pain. Her skin color was bad, taking on a yellowish tinge that experienced midwives recognized as a sign of serious liver problems. She was clearly, obviously seriously ill, and whatever was causing her belly to swell to such grotesque, unnatural proportions wasn't moving or behaving like any baby the experienced midwives had ever encountered in their decades of attending births. Weeks dragged by with agonizing slowness. Mary's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that frightened everyone who witnessed it. She developed a fever that wouldn't break no matter what remedies the physicians tried. Her skin took on an increasingly pronounced yellowish tinge that suggested her liver was failing. She could barely eat more than a few bites without experiencing violent nausea. She could barely stand without assistance, and even sitting upright in bed left her gasping for breath. The massive growth in her abdomen seemed to be pressing directly on her internal organs, physically displacing her stomach, her intestines, her diaphragm, making it increasingly difficult for her to breathe properly or digest food. Physicians whispered among themselves in the corridors, too frightened to speak their growing suspicions aloud where they might be overheard. This wasn't a pregnancy. This couldn't possibly be a pregnancy. This was something going catastrophically wrong inside their queen's body, something they had no medical framework to understand or treat. Tumors were certainly known in Tudor medicine. Physicians had encountered various types of abnormal growths, cysts, and swellings in their careers, but nothing like this. Growths didn't typically mimic pregnancy so completely and convincingly. Tumors didn't cause the breast changes, the morning sickness, the hormonal shifts that Mary had clearly documented experienced. Some of the doctors began to wonder in hushed, frightened conversations if they were dealing with something their entire medical training had never prepared them for, something that existed outside the known boundaries of natural philosophy and medical science. What was growing inside the queen? And perhaps more terrifyingly, what would happen when she finally died and they could examine it? The teratoma that had been growing inside Mary's ovary for years was now in its advanced, malignant stage. What had started as a relatively small mass during her 20s had slowly expanded throughout her 30s, consuming more and more space in her abdominal cavity. By the time she was 40 years old, the tumor likely weighed several pounds, and measured close to 10 inches in diameter, roughly the size of a large grapefruit or small melon. Inside this mass, something biologically impossible was happening. Cells that should have remained dormant and inactive were receiving confused developmental signals. Germ cells that should have simply become eggs were instead following chaotic, disorganized pathways of differentiation. The tumor was attempting to build complex structures without any coherent blueprint or organizing principle. Patches of skin tissue were forming in random locations. Hair follicles were developing, complete with functioning sebaceous glands that produced oil. Most disturbingly, calcified structures were appearing throughout the mass. Primitive teeth complete with enamel and root structures, fragments of bone with active marrow tissue inside. The teratoma was literally trying to build body parts inside Mary's abdomen, following the same basic developmental instructions that create a human being, but without any coordination or purpose. It was biological chaos, a nightmare of misplaced tissues and structures that had no business existing. And it was producing massive amounts of HCG and other pregnancy hormones, flooding Mary's bloodstream and convincing her endocrine system that she was carrying a child. The tumor had effectively hijacked her body's reproductive biology, creating the most convincing false pregnancy possible while simultaneously killing her from the inside. As the teratoma continued growing, it didn't just occupy space, it actively invaded surrounding tissues. Malignant teratomas send out microscopic projections called pseudopodia, cellular fingers that reach into healthy tissue and establish new blood supplies to feed the tumor's growth. Inside Mary's body, these projections had spread from her ovary into her uterus, wrapping around her fallopian tubes and extending into her intestinal wall. The tumor was essentially consuming her reproductive organs, replacing functional tissue with chaotic, disorganized cell masses. Each monthly cycle, each hormonal fluctuation, each physical stress on her body accelerated the growth. The psychological stress of the first phantom pregnancy, the emotional devastation of admitting failure, the desperate hope of the second pregnancy announcement, all of these created hormonal cascades that likely fed the tumor's expansion. Stress hormones like cortisol can actually promote cancer growth in certain types of tumors. Mary's desperate desire for a child was quite literally feeding the thing that was killing her. The pain she experienced was the tumor pressing against nerve clusters in her abdominal cavity, triggering intense pain signals. The difficulty breathing was the mass pushing up against her diaphragm, preventing her lungs from expanding fully. The inability to eat was the tumor compressing her stomach and intestines, leaving no room for food. Every symptom she suffered had a concrete biological cause, rooted in the expanding mass of tissue inside her. And there was absolutely nothing that Tudor medicine could do to help her. On November 17, 1558, at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, Mary Tudor finally died. The official cause listed on death records was influenza, which was technically accurate. She had contracted a severe respiratory infection in her final weeks. But everyone who had attended her closely during her final months knew that influenza was merely the final blow. The real killer had been growing inside her for years. As soon as she drew her final breath, and the attending priest had administered the last rites, the physicians she had specifically designated sprang into action with unusual speed. They had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, knowing they would finally get answers to questions that had haunted them for years. What had caused the phantom pregnancies? What had been growing inside their queen? The examination took place immediately in her private chambers at St. James's Palace, before the body could begin to decay and before political forces could intervene to stop them. Present were Dr. George Owen, who had served as Mary's personal physician for years and had witnessed both phantom pregnancies firsthand. Dr. Thomas Wendy was there, the man who had tried to speak truth to power years earlier and had been punished for his honesty. Several junior doctors and medical assistants were also present, all of them sworn to absolute secrecy about whatever they might discover. They worked by candlelight in the pre-dawn darkness, moving quickly and efficiently. The room was cold, which helped preserve the body in slow decomposition. They had their instruments ready: scalpels, forceps, clamps, bowls to collect fluids, cloths to absorb blood. They positioned the body carefully on the examination table. And then Dr. Owen made the first incision. The moment the scalpel cut through skin and the physicians began peeling back the layers of tissue, the smell hit them like a physical blow. It was profoundly, deeply wrong. Not the normal, expected odor of a recently deceased body, but something putrid and decayed that suggested whatever was inside had been dying and rotting for a long time, possibly years. Several of the younger physicians gagged. One had to step away from the table to compose himself. But the senior doctors continued working, cutting deeper through the abdominal muscles, using clamps to hold back the tissue. When they finally exposed Mary's internal organs fully and could see directly into her abdominal cavity, every single physician in that room froze in shock. There, occupying most of her pelvic region and extending up into her lower abdomen, was a mass unlike anything any of them had ever encountered in their entire medical careers. It was enormous, easily the size of a full-term baby, which immediately and horrifyingly explained why Mary's belly had swollen so dramatically during both phantom pregnancies. But it was absolutely, clearly not a child. Not even close. The growth was irregular and lumpy, with a surface texture that looked fundamentally wrong. Dark, diseased tissue was visible across large sections of it. Areas of necrosis, dead, rotting tissue, covered perhaps a third of the mass, black and putrid. It had attached itself firmly to Mary's uterus and had completely consumed both of her ovaries. Where healthy reproductive organs should have been, there was only tumor. Long, thin projections extended from the main mass like roots or tendrils, wrapping around sections of her intestines and pressing against her bladder. The tumor had quite literally invaded her body, colonizing healthy tissue and replacing it with cancerous growth. One of the junior doctors made a choking, gagging sound and had to turn away from the table completely. Another whispered a prayer in Latin, his hands shaking visibly as he held the candle closer. Dr. Wendy, who had suspected something like this years earlier when he first examined Mary, stared at the massive tumor with an expression that mixed horror, vindication, and profound sadness. He had been right. This was no pregnancy, no psychological delusion, no simple medical misunderstanding. This was a catastrophic, malignant growth that had been slowly devouring the queen from the inside for years. But the true visceral horror became fully apparent when they tried to remove the mass for closer examination and documentation. It had grown so large, spread so extensively, and fused so completely with surrounding organs that extracting it was nearly impossible without destroying what little remained of Mary's reproductive system. The doctors worked carefully and methodically, making detailed notes that they knew would likely never see the light of day, would probably be destroyed or sealed away forever. The tumor appeared to have originated in Mary's right ovary years earlier, then metastasized and spread to her uterus, her left ovary, and beyond into surrounding tissue. It was dark in color, almost black in places where necrosis was most advanced. But when they carefully cut into the tumor's surface to examine its internal structure, they discovered something that made even these experienced physicians recoil in shock. Inside the mass, embedded in the chaotic tissue, were teeth. Actual, fully formed human teeth with roots and enamel. Several of them scattered throughout different sections of the tumor. And hair. Strands and patches of human hair, complete with follicles, growing from within the mass. Owen's hands were shaking as he used forceps to carefully extract one of the teeth for closer examination. It was real. Completely, unmistakably real. A human tooth, properly formed, with a fully developed root structure. How was this possible? How could teeth be growing inside the queen's ovary? What biological process could possibly explain this nightmare? The physicians didn't have answers. The medical knowledge of 1558 had no framework for understanding what they were witnessing. In their minds, shaped by centuries of classical medical theory and religious understanding of the human body, what they were seeing was impossible. Teeth didn't grow inside tumors. Hair didn't sprout from masses in the womb. These were structures that belonged in very specific places in the human body. Teeth in the mouth, hair on the head and body. Finding them inside a tumor felt like discovering evidence of something fundamentally wrong with the natural order of creation. Some of the physicians present that night would later describe it in religious terms, suggesting they had witnessed something demonic or unnatural. But what they had actually discovered was a teratoma. A tumor that modern medicine now understands contains pluripotent cells capable of differentiating into any tissue type. The teeth, the hair, the fragments of bone they found were all the result of confused developmental pathways. Cells that should have become eggs had instead received garbled instructions and tried to build body parts. The result was biological chaos, a horrifying mixture of tissues that created structures without purpose or organization. This was Mary's legacy. Not a child, not an heir to secure the Catholic succession, but a nightmare of misplaced tissues growing inside her womb. The physicians continued their examination for hours, documenting everything they found with meticulous detail. The tumor had caused massive damage to Mary's internal organs. Her uterus was compressed and distorted, pushed aside by the growing mass. Her intestines showed signs of chronic compression and inflammation where the tumor had pressed against them for years. Her bladder wall was thickened and scarred. The growth had been slowly destroying her from the inside, consuming space and resources her body needed to function normally. They also noted something that provided a partial explanation for the pregnancy symptoms. The tumor had caused Mary's body to produce not just HCG but other hormones as well. Her breasts had leaked fluid, not milk, but a hormone-induced secretion that mimicked lactation. Her body had been chemically tricked on every level into believing pregnancy was occurring. Modern medicine would eventually classify this as a hormone-secreting teratoma, a rare subtype that produces pregnancy hormones and causes pseudocyesis, false pregnancy, with genuine physical symptoms. The fact that Mary had survived for years with this advanced malignant tumor was itself medically remarkable. Most patients with tumors of this size and severity died much more quickly. The physicians theorized that Mary's stubborn willpower, her absolute refusal to give up hope of producing an heir, had somehow kept her alive long past when the disease should have killed her. She had endured unimaginable pain, had watched her body swell and distort, had felt something moving inside her that she desperately wanted to believe was England's future. And all along it was cancer. A mass of her own cells, turned against her, growing and consuming and eventually killing her. When the examination was finally complete, when every observation had been documented and every organ had been examined, the physicians faced a terrible politically charged decision. What should they do with this information? The truth was devastating on multiple levels that went far beyond simple medical interest. Mary had ruled England for 5 brutal years, burning hundreds of Protestant heretics, attempting to drag the country back to Catholic orthodoxy by force. She had believed herself pregnant twice, had made major political and religious decisions based on absolute certainty that she would produce a Catholic heir. The phantom pregnancies had humiliated her before every court in Europe, had damaged England's international reputation, had affected succession planning and foreign policy in ways that rippled across the continent. And all of it, every bit of suffering, every political miscalculation, every humiliation, had been caused by a massive cancerous tumor filled with teeth and hair that had been growing inside her womb for years. If this information became public, if people across Europe learned that the Catholic Queen had been literally consumed by disease from the inside while she persecuted Protestants and tried to reverse the Reformation, the propaganda damage would be absolutely catastrophic. Protestant pamphleteers would have a field day. They would claim it was divine judgment, incontrovertible proof that God had cursed Mary's body for her religious persecution. They would say the tumor was a physical manifestation of the evil and corruption inside her, that her barren womb had sprouted teeth and hair instead of children because she was morally and spiritually diseased. The Catholic cause in England, already precarious after Mary's death and Elizabeth's succession, would be irreparably damaged. So the physicians made a decision that would stand unchallenged for over 400 years. They would bury the truth along with Mary's body. The official autopsy report was deliberately vague and carefully sanitized of any disturbing details. Cause of death: influenza complicated by dropsy and other unspecified ailments. No mention of the tumor, no description of the teeth and hair, no explanation of what had really caused the phantom pregnancies. The physical evidence would be buried with the Queen in a sealed lead coffin where it could never be examined or questioned by future generations. The lead coffin was crucial to the cover-up. Lead was extremely expensive, but it served multiple purposes. It would preserve Mary's remains by sealing them away from air and moisture, preventing decay. But more importantly, for those who wanted the truth buried, it would make it nearly impossible for anyone to open the coffin later without massive effort, extensive resources, and official sanction from both church and state. Whatever physical evidence existed of Mary's teratoma, of the biological nightmare that had destroyed her hopes and killed her slowly, was locked away forever. Or so they thought. Mary's body lies today in Westminster Abbey in London, buried in the same vault as her half-sister Elizabeth. The lead coffin, sealed in 1558, has never been opened. Modern medical imaging technology could potentially answer every remaining question about what was inside Mary Tudor. Ground-penetrating radar, CT scans, even non-invasive chemical analysis could potentially confirm the presence of the teratoma, could identify the calcified structures like teeth and bone fragments, could finally provide definitive proof of what killed England's first queen regnant. But Westminster Abbey has consistently refused every request from historians and medical researchers to examine the tomb. The official reason given is always the same: respect for the dead, preservation of sacred historical sites, the ethical concerns around disturbing royal remains. But after learning what you now know, you have to wonder, is there another reason? Is the truth about Bloody Mary's body still too disturbing, too politically sensitive even after more than 4 centuries? The secret remains buried in lead and stone beneath one of England's most sacred religious sites. And every year, thousands of tourists visit Westminster Abbey and stand before the tomb of Mary I, completely unaware that just beneath their feet lies the answer to one of history's most disturbing medical mysteries. An answer that 3 physicians witnessed by candlelight in 1558. An answer that shocked them into silence, that some of them took to early graves. The thing that was inside Bloody Mary. The thing she believed was England's heir. The thing that produced teeth instead of a baby, hair instead of hope. A teratoma, a biological nightmare. A tragedy written in flesh and bone, sealed away where no one can see it, preserved in lead for eternity. If this story shocked you as much as it shocked those physicians in 1558, do 3 things right now. Hit that subscribe button, because we're the only channel digging into the medical mysteries that history tried to bury. Drop a comment telling us whether Westminster Abbey should finally open Mary's tomb and let modern science examine what's really inside. Your engagement helps this reach more people who need to know the real history. And smash that like button if you believe the truth, no matter how disturbing, deserves to be told. These aren't just stories. These are real events, real people, real biological nightmares that powerful institutions have kept hidden for centuries. And you're part of bringing them to light.